David, you had to create a new board and find a new chair for this organisation. Can you talk to me about this experience?
Yes, so this is a major challenge that came towards the end of the whole project, and what we wanted to do was make sure that the four organisations by then were, so the four founding organisations were represented on the new board. So we found a mechanism by which people who had been associated with the founder organisations would have a presence on the board. So that gave us a starting point. And actually those four people formed an initial board, and we then looked at what were the skills gaps that we had for to make up the rest of the board, and then we recruited other individuals from our sectors. And we did this through asking the founding organisations to nominate people. So each organisation put forward proposals, and then we made approaches. And this meant that we had new people coming onto the board who hadn't been associated with the project. They were still people that we felt identified with the work of the founder organisations and were going to provide continuity in terms of the sector. So that was important. And then the final stage of that was to appoint the chair. But if I just talk about the recruitment of the board at this point, I think that the initial four members of the board were actually very strong. And I think in retrospect, and if I was doing this again, I would keep those four members of the board until such time that the new organisation was up and running. That we had a company secretary, we had a kind of vice chair, so all of the kind of legal requirements were covered off in those four people. I think the additional change and the additional dynamic that came about by expanding the board very quickly added a complication into the project, which in the end didn't necessarily help progress. So my advice to people doing this was, stick with your initial kind of interim board and get the organisation up and running and get your staff in place and get the whole thing. And then actually the recruitment of the board can become a whole organisational issue, as opposed to something that ended up, in our case, becoming quite isolated. As project manager, it was quite difficult for me to be involved in the recruitment of the board because obviously I was a member of staff. So I was going on a kind of personal journey with the project, which meant that people who I was asking or potentially asking to be on the board might ultimately be involved in whether or not I would or wouldn't work for the new organisation. So that made a very difficult dynamic, I think, for members of the team, and it meant that the recruitment of the board was almost divorced from the core team who had been leading the project. And of course this then became a problem because the executive or the team leading the project was miles ahead of the board that ended up being recruited. And then the board who were recruited weren't able to say, well, okay, we understand that there's been 2 or 3 years worth of work here and that we're happy to take this work as our starting point and build on this. Actually what happened was the board came in and immediately started questioning quite a lot of work that had gone on, and we felt that actually we were going back over old ground. And of course the new board wanted to assert themselves, and we needed to give space for new people coming onto the board to assert their ideas and assert their viewpoints. But what was interesting to me was watching how the initial board kind of stood back and allowed that to happen. So actually suddenly the dynamic of the project became hugely influenced by completely new thoughts and people coming into the project who previously hadn't had really in-depth knowledge because they lived with the project throughout the whole journey. So I thought that was a really interesting consequence of appointing the board in that way.